Manned human torpedoes were first devised in the early 1900s by the British Royal Navy, but it was Italy that first put them into combat and used them to their full destructive advantage during World War II. By the early 1940s, Italy became a superpower at underwater warfare, and their Maiale torpedoes would inflict severe damage against British forces in the Mediterranean. But as the war progressed and Italy's influence diminished, Germany would pick up the torch and develop its own torpedo-carrying craft called the Neger. Several countries such as the United States, Russia, and Argentina would eventually build their own versions of manned torpedoes, with Japan even using them as suicide weapons, and many of them, including Italy, still build and deploy them to this day. A risky idea. The idea for a tiny manned submarine able to carry a bomb or torpedo first emerged in 1909. It was developed by Commander Godfrey Herbert, a British naval officer. But the War Office rejected the concept because it was unfeasible and unsafe. Still, even though manned torpedoes weren't ultimately used in World War I, Italy was the first country to put the innovative tool to the test in 1918. Manned torpedoes consisted of a propeller, diving planes for pitch, and a vertical rudder. Some designs involved enclosed seats and an air supply, but it was not unusual that some kind of rebreather was needed. Most of them had 4 flotation tanks that could be flooded or emptied for buoyancy and attitude adjustments. Control panels were placed at the front, and navigation instruments included a compass. The Regia Marina, or Italian Navy, built a primitive submarine known as Miniata, which carried 2 frogmen and a limpet mine. The device successfully sank the Austro-Hungarian battleship SMS Viribus Unitis. Still, the frogmen were unequipped with breathing sets, and they were forced to swim with their heads above the water. They were eventually spotted and taken as prisoners. It wasn't until World War II that the Italian Navy would make the most out of their ingenious crafts. The first practical manned torpedo was the Maiale, or the Pig, a nickname earned because it was, quote, a pig to steer. After 4 years in development, the first 11 Maiales were completed in 1939 at the San Bartolomeo Torpedo Workshops in La Spezia. The slow-running torpedoes were officially called Siluro a Lento Corsa. 2 models were built, Series 100 and then Series 200 in 1942, with some improvements. By September of 1943, the Regia Marina possessed at least 50 manned torpedoes. The Maiale was electrically propelled and had a 1.6 horsepower motor. It could plunge to 49 feet, and hypothetically 98 feet if necessary. Its top speed was 3 knots, and thus a conventional submarine needed to launch the small device near the target. Despite the assistance, the Maiale could take up to 2 hours to reach its mark. The crewmen donned diving suits and carried oxygen rebreathers. Upon reaching its target, the torpedo's warhead could be detached and used as a limpet mine under the enemy vessel. The operators then had enough time to flee to safety, hopefully undetected. And that's why most missions were programmed to take place at night or even during a new moon. Despite Italy's unsuccessful streak of attacks during 1940, their navy strengthened its forces and became notably skillful in underwater warfare. By 1941, the Italians would be ready to go one-on-one against the British forces. Italy comes to the front. During the continuous fight for supremacy in the Mediterranean, the Germans weakened the Royal Navy and left them with only 2 battleships anchored at Alexandria, HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth. It was then that the Italians unleashed the full power of their navy and employed their unpaired Maiales. On December 14, 1941, submarine Skide left Leros Island with 3 Siluros Alenta Corsa and 10 brave frogmen. The vessel headed to the port of Alexandria, arriving 4 days later. The commando team launched its mission around midnight, and 3 guided semi-submerged torpedoes sailed towards the harbor. The Italians found a steel anti-submarine net at the entrance, but the gates were open for the British battleships, and the frogmen sneaked right behind them. The team split up once inside. One unit planted a mine behind HMS Queen Elizabeth, fixing a tow line on its bilge keels with the charge directly underneath. They then planted mines under the Sagona tanker. However, the unit in charge of HMS Valiant quickly ran into difficulties. The breathing apparatus of one of the divers malfunctioned merely a couple of meters from their target, and he had to gasp for air on the surface. The torpedo also failed and sank to the bottom of the ocean. Lieutenant Luigi de la Penne had to trawl the Maiale himself, positioning the machine below the Valiant, near the magazine of its first turret. As they completed the mission, the frogmen were identified and captured by the British. Several of them were interrogated on board HMS Valiant, but none of the prisoners confessed. Around 6 a.m. on December 19th, the charge under the Valiant was detonated, followed by the Queen Elizabeth and then the Sagona. All 6 frogmen survived the explosions and immediately became heroes, with Lieutenant de la Penne receiving the Gold Medal of Military Valor when the war ended. New models. The Italian advantage would not last long. The British secured several Italian submersibles and crafted their own version of the manned torpedo within a year. The first version was the Chariot, which was partially successful as a weapon. Later versions included the X-class submarine, a midget vehicle that wasn't really a manned torpedo but was larger, faster, and more capable. Still, the Italians would attempt more strikes against the British merely a year after their victory in Alexandria. In December of 1942, 3 Italian divers lost their lives during an offensive near Gibraltar. But in the late spring of 1943, the Italians managed to sink 6 Allied merchant ships with the Maiale. During this time, the Italians planned to launch another model with a partially enclosed cockpit, the San Bartolomeo torpedo. In October of 1943, the larger manned torpedo was meant to attack Gibraltar carrying 4 frogmen, but Italy suddenly surrendered and the confrontation was called off. The new model never saw combat, and all the Italian intelligence and military technology fell under Allied hands. Germany gives it a try. In 1943, Germany developed its own torpedo-carrying craft called the Neger. This vessel could not completely submerge and was intended for only 1 man. It also didn't have capabilities for air supply, and a rebreather was required. Unlike the Maiale, the Neger carried a second G7E torpedo slung beneath its manned one. The pilot could aim at a target using a spike at the nose, and then fire the torpedo while the crewed vehicle returned safely to base. However, the second torpedo would sometimes fail to detach, dragging the manned one at 30 knots and leaving the vulnerable pilot unable to stop its trajectory. The malfunction cost many lives. Germany first used the Negers in combat during the Battle of Anzio in early 1944. But the torpedoes failed when going into deep enough waters in prams due to insufficient cranes or suitable equipment. Many pilots perished even before the operation began. Even worse, when the Germans finally arrived, they found no supply ships in the harbor, and the Negers torpedoed only 2 small warships and a coast defense gun. Still, this knowledge would serve them well during the Normandy invasion a few months later. In early July of 1944, the Germans took advantage of the fast currents off the coast of Normandy to send raids of Negers to the nearest Allied beach, the British stronghold Sword. A raid of 26 Negers parted from the coast of Trouville-sur-Mer the night of July 5th, navigating with a wrist compass and the stars above. The attack was unexpected, and the defense was relentless. Only 9 Negers got back, but 2 British minesweepers were taken down. On a second raid 3 days later, 21 Negers were launched, but they were quickly spotted by the British. A rain of anti-submarine depth charges befell the Germans, but they still scored 2 more hits. Another minesweeper, HMS Palladius, was believed to have been struck by mines, but it was later found in the 2000s and believed to have been sunk by 2 Neger torpedoes. Still, the biggest prize was sinking the light cruiser Dragon on loan to the Polish Navy. The Neger's pilot, Werner Gerhold, was later awarded the Knight's Cross due to his actions that day. Gerhold, like the manned torpedoes, was prominently used in subsequent Nazi propaganda. 2 more attacks followed in late July and early August, when the improved version of the German manned torpedo, the Marder, sank 2 Allied ships. The Marder included a flooding tank, which allowed the vehicle to dive at 82 feet. This capability improved its survivability against anti-submarine airstrikes. Still, German torpedo attacks during the last stages of the war proved insignificant against the Allied naval forces, and in the end, they proved more lethal to their own operators than to their enemies. Thank you for watching. If you liked our video, please hit the like button and tell us in the comments below whether you think manned torpedoes were an effective combat tool. Also, subscribe to our channels to get more exciting historical content.